Augustine's Rule, a commentary by Adler Zumkeller OSA, Chapter 5, Humility, the Foundation. The interiorization and purification before God of the motives for our actions are important subjects to which Augustine returns repeatedly in the Rule. He regards pride and arrogance as defective attitudes that are almost unmatched as dangers to loving harmony in a religious community. Therefore, before going on to develop his program of religious life, he endeavors to strengthen the foundation, which is humility. No one in a monastery is safe against pride. There are any number of points at which this vice may make its way in, and it manifests itself in a variety of ways. In dealing with this problem, Augustine once again distinguishes his brethren into the two groups already discussed. He turns first to those who had lived in poverty while in the world, and then to those who had enjoyed wealth and esteem. At first glance, the rich would seem to be more in danger of pride. They may be tempted to it not only by the high rank of rich parents and relatives, but by the demanding sacrifice they have made in contributing a part of their wealth to the common life. What Augustine says here of the rich applies equally to those who have entered the monastery as well educated or especially talented and able people. From a human point of view, all such individuals can be valuable members of the community. But if they are proud of what they contribute to the service of the monastery, they rob their good deeds of value in God's sight. Indeed, the effect of their conceit is far more profound than it seems outwardly to be. Their entire monastic life is deprived of its fruit. More than that, the valuable contributions they make are rendered displeasing to God by the ignoble pride that motivates them. Augustine writes on this subject: of what value is it for these unfortunates to give their property to the poor and become poor themselves, if their contempt of wealth makes them more arrogant than when they possessed it? Augustine very effectively leaves his question unanswered. The principle to be followed here is the one he sets down in a sermon. Do not praise yourself even if you are good, for when you boast of your own goodness, you become evil. Sermon 2 on Psalm 25. He even dares to assert that God is better pleased by evil deeds combined with humility than by good works combined with pride. He bases this claim on the proud Pharisee and the humble tax collector of the Lord's parable, on Psalm 93. It is possible for proud monks and nuns to think themselves pleasing to God, just as the Pharisee did. But when their lives come to a close, they will perhaps be forced to admit that they appear before God with empty hands, because in their lifetime they did their good works not in the final analysis for Him, but for themselves, that is, for their own satisfaction and honor. It is understandable that those who had been rich should be tempted to pride. Yet those who come from a simple or even impoverished background are no more safe against pride. The very fact that their entrance into religious life has put them on the same social level as formerly high-ranking people can be dangerous for them. St. Augustine seems to have had painful experience of this phenomenon in his capacity as superior of a monastery. He is aware that persons who had been poor not infrequently become proud and demanding in the monastery, while others who had enjoyed wealth and esteem in the world grow in humility. He says on one occasion that it is sometimes hard to determine whether poor persons have entered the monastery because they have decided to serve God or simply in order to be respected by those who in the past had habitually treated them with oppressive disdain. This is from the Work of Monks, chapter 22. Let them rather lift up their hearts, is Augustine's advice, to those brothers and sisters who come from the lower classes of society. The words sursum corda in Latin were already part of the Eucharistic liturgy, and therefore familiar to his followers. They should lift up their hearts, so that they will seek not what is vain and earthly, but the blessings of heaven. The quest of earthly prestige imperils true salvation, because pride has the same effect here as in the case of formerly wealthy monks and nuns. It makes their monastic life worthless in God's sight. Augustine's warnings against pride and his exhortation to lift up our hearts and not seek what is vain and earthly are still relevant and timely for us today. The striving for consumer goods and enjoyment that is so large a part of our environment makes its way into religious life in many forms and brings with it the temptation to set our hearts on earthly things or to seek prestige and self-satisfaction in what we do. If we yield to it, we have in principle turned away from the following of Christ. Augustine regards pride as the original sin that has brought such immense misery upon the human race. Humility, on the contrary, is for him the basic attitude of a redeemed human being, and the Lord himself is our model for it. Humility is not so much a result of our own striving as it is a gracious gift bestowed by the Holy Spirit. Augustine never tires of praising humility, because he sees it as a constitutive element of Christian perfection. He is convinced, indeed, that love is a higher value, but he also knows that authentic love of God can flower only in the soil of humility. He has a more profound grasp and has given a better justification of humility than the theologians who preceded him. Do you want to be great? He asks in a sermon. Then begin with what is very small. Do you want to build a large, tall house? Concentrate first on the foundation, which is humility. Sermon 69. He is even bold enough to say, our perfection is to be found precisely in humility, on Psalm 130. Augustine's teaching on humility is distinguished by its Christocentrism. In trying to explain what humility is and to show its importance in our lives, he repeatedly sets Jesus Christ before us. The Lord is both our teacher and our model of humility. In the incarnation of God's Son as a human being, out of love for us, Augustine sees above all an act of divine self-emptying, or as he likes to say, of God's humility. The mystery of the incarnation stirred him deeply. In a sermon, he describes this humility of the Redeemer as follows. Christ was to come in the flesh, but how? He was to be born in mortal flesh as a little infant lying in a crib, wrapped in swaddling clothes, fed with milk. All these are signs of humility. They are the outward setting for a vast humility. The preacher continues, who is it that practices such humility? Someone in high place. Who in high place? Do not look about on earth, but ascend above the stars, ascend above all creatures, ascend to the Creator and see there that in the beginning was the Word. Sermon 293. Augustine likes then to think of the Redeemer as the humble Christ, the Christ who freely chose to abase and empty himself. He urgently warns us that if we desire truly to follow the Lord and understand him and find and possess him, we must imitate his example of humility and lowliness. The mind of the unbeliever is closed to this knowledge, for God has hidden this from the wise and the prudent and revealed it to the little ones. Matthew 11:25. The humble must cling to humility of God, and with its powerful assistance ascend to the heights of God. Sermon 184. In his book, Holy Virginity, Augustine goes in greater detail into what the following of the humble Jesus must mean for Christians in religious life. As in his rule, he points out here that pride is an insidious sin, for it makes even the external good that we do displeasing to God. Augustine therefore warns us, in the words of Ben Sira the sage, the greater you are, the more you must humble yourself to everyone. Then you will find favor with God. Sirach chapter 3 verse 18. He warns us against spiritual arrogance and self-satisfaction at our supposed virtues. I am concerned lest you act like the Pharisee who arrogantly boasted of his merits. I am afraid lest you love little because you think you have little that needs forgiveness. Unholy Virginity 37. In Augustine's view, there is no more powerful weapon against spiritual pride than the word and example of Christ. He cites the Lord's words, "Learn from me, that I am humble of heart," Matthew 11:28. And he draws this conclusion from it. You need not, therefore, turn to the man who did not dare raise his eyes to heaven because he was so burdened with sin. Go rather to him whom the burden of love brought down from heaven. You need not turn to her who wet her Lord's feet with her tears in order to obtain forgiveness for her serious sins. Turn rather to him who, as Redeemer from all sin, washed the feet of his servants. Holy Virginity 37:38. Augustine goes on to give his followers some pieces of advice that reflect his own rich experience of religious life and his own ascetical efforts. He does not ask us to overlook or deny the good in ourselves and our lives. That would not be honest or truthful. However, we are not to pride ourselves on this good, but rather to see it all as God's gift. Augustine writes, "Isn't it absurd that you should have less love for him from whom you have received more than others have?" Holy Virginity number 40. Here is another bit of advice for guarding against spiritual pride. fasten your gaze more on what you still lack than on what you have. For if you think of how much you still fall short, you will lament the fact, and if you lament it, you will be healed. Become humble and walk securely, far from pride and arrogance. Sermon 354. The attitude of humility which Augustine recommends in this chapter of his rule and elsewhere in his writings is also the basic mood of his own soul as he renders an account to himself in his confessions of his religious life and efforts at that time. He still finds a great deal of imperfection in himself, a great deal of uncertainty and insecurity. He still feels himself to be weak and sinful. Therefore he prays, our only hope, our only confidence, the only firm promise that we have is your mercy. Confessions 10:32. But he is also convinced with the apostle that I can do everything through him who strengthens me. Philippians 4:13. Therefore he also prays, give me strength, O Lord, so that I may do all things. All this makes it clear, O holy God, that when your commands are obeyed, it is from you that we receive the power to obey them. Confessions 10:31-45.